we're going to get started. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Nancy Rabalais, who is the Shell Oil Endowed Chair in Oceanography and Coastal Sciences with Louisiana State University. I'm going to go ahead and read your biography, which I'm sure gloats about you, right? So, Nancy Rabalais has worked for more than 30 years to bring national attention to water quality and ecosystem concerns in the Gulf of Mexico. She leads Louisiana Universities Marine Consortium and Louisiana State University's annual survey of the Gulf hypoxic zone, tracking the impact that nutrient runoff from agriculture and developed lands in the Mississippi River watershed has had on coastal habitats. Also referred to as the dead zone, the hypoxic zone is a largely human-caused phenomenon where there's too little oxygen to support marine life. Rabelais' work on coastal water quality has extended to recovery efforts following the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill and restoration of coastal habitats following natural disasters, including hurricanes Katrina and Harvey. So let's please welcome Dr. Nancy Rabalais.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm tired of talking. No.
This is not good.
I'm going to take you through a small history of the world, which is my world, taking you from my first interest in biology to where I am today, and then intersperse it with how I got involved in science policy. And I'm not doing this because I want you to emulate me, but I want to show you just some of the different things that I've done in my career, and also like talk about some of the people who work for me, so you can see what kind of jobs they have. Okay, so we are doing this. Okay, so part of my history is my dissertation research, which was a physiological ecology study of a fiddler crab, which live in marshes, except in South Texas where there's no rain. They live in hard rock cement soil, hardly call it soil. And so it had to do with that and all their things that they did differently because they lived in an environment that got 14 inches of rain every year, maybe twice a year or maybe just once a year. So my byline is chasing fiddler crabs around South Texas did not prepare me for congressional testimony, which is where I've gone since I chased these fiddler crabs around South Texas. This is where I started. I was a Hamlin Junior High School rebel in Corpus Christi, Texas, and I fell in love with my biology teacher in 8th grade, and surprisingly enough, the only thing that I can remember we did that year is that I strained bacon bits out of bacon fat and somehow ended up making a bar of soap. So I don't know how that fit in biology, but that's the thing I remember. And I also went on to take 2 years of biology at my high school, which was in a 3-year building, except now 4-year buildings. And amazingly, we were the Carroll Tigers. And I am now an LSU Tiger. So I've gone full circle in this. Cocodrie doesn't have a mascot. So spent 33 years of my life without a mascot. That was terrible. Had a really hard time. And then I worked my way through school. So my academic career might be very different from yours if you're going 4 years through college. I'm sure many of you work, or you work during the summer. That's part of your college education as well. But I did 2 years at Corpus Christi Del Mar College, so it's a 2-year college. It's in Corpus Christi, Texas, which is where I spent most of my life growing up. It's about 2/3 of the way down the Texas coast, towards Mexico. And I took all of my basic courses there. I took my French because I was going to go to a regional university, Texas A&I University, to finish out the last 2 years. So from Delmar College, I went to Texas A&I University. And this M, I have tried to cover up with an I, because the Texas A&M system took over all the small colleges and it became Texas A&M University, Kingsville. But my degree, my final degree was at the University of Texas, which is a big rival of the Aggies. So the Longhorns, Hook 'em Horns, and the Aggies, which had I don't know what their mascot was, but we had Longhorns. So after I did my bachelor's and my master's at A&I, while I was there, I started taking a lot of classes that took field trips into South Texas, estuaries and bays and beaches, and I also started learning how to scuba dive. So I got very interested in marine invertebrates. And at the Port Aransas Marine Lab, my training as a biologist, as undergraduate and master's, is, I forgot to put the park service in. Okay. Padre Island National Seashore. I spent 6 months being a park rangerette to help the tourists learn something about the barrier island ecology. And that was a lot of fun, and it might have gone on, except they kept promising me a job and they weren't making enough progress. So I went to work at Port Aransas Marine Science Institute, which is very near Corpus Christi, but on barrier islands. And this facility took a major hit in Hurricane Harvey. Major hit. Some big oil rig on a barge broke loose and took out this whole pier. They have this brand new building, which is demolished. They had just finished it. It was all solar and green, and they moved everything from the old building into that one because they thought it was safer, and it's the one that got knocked out. I spent a hurricane in this building over here many years ago, because the upper part was stable and the bottom part was made to wash away if a big storm surge came through. So it's part of my life as a marine scientist on the Gulf Coast. Okay, and so then I went to the University of Texas at Austin. After doing work here, doing benthic ecology and sorting benthic animals, to the University of Texas, where I spent a semester there doing my teaching responsibilities, and then I moved back to here. And then from here, I went to Louisiana Universities Marine Consortium, and recently I have now joined the faculty of Louisiana State University, Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences. I think they waited, this was the Women Month in 2017. I guess they thought, okay, she's been here long enough. We're going to make her a woman champion scientist, and so they turned me into purple and gold. So I told my daughter that, and she thought that was pretty funny, because I'm not a big rah-rah, certainly not a football coach. All right, so the work that I do centers around this. You can have a hypothesis, and you can just test it. It can be a curiosity, it can be a prediction. Or sometimes we do research because management wants an answer to something, or they need to know more about it. And many managers don't want to know, but your scientific curiosity drives you to find that answer. And that's how directed research programs develop. And with the input from the directed research programs, you can implement management strategies if that's a focus of the work. You can monitor the system, you can interpret the data, and maybe improve a management plan and have adaptive management, or it's possible that your data may lead you in a different research direction. So I've been through a lot of this in my career. I did work on crabs when I got to Louisiana, but the idea of the low oxygen that I talked about last night was becoming more and more prevalent, more and more places around the world, and the director of the Marine Lab where I worked when I came there, which looked like this, trailers. This is the benthic trailer. And this is Nancy when she came to Louisiana. And this is the zooplankton trailer. And this is the stay overnight trailer. And the director got the one that didn't flood during the hurricane. It's like the ship right now. We've had all kinds of ways of doing the winch. And the winch operator now has a place that's totally out of the weather. So the scientists are the only ones that get wet on the back deck of the ship now. But anyway. So that's where I started, and the director at the time, Don Bosch, if you were there last night, he did the recipe for the corn and shrimp soup. Knew that, he came from Chesapeake Bay, he knew that there was low oxygen there, and he also knew that the nitrate was going up in the Susquehanna River, which dominated the outflow to Chesapeake Bay. He was a member of what he called the 900 Club, which was you can donate to a politician in Louisiana up to $900 or up to $1,000 without having to report it. And so, as a director of the lab, he had to be objective, and he shouldn't choose parties, but he did donate to the 900 Club. And that was Senator John Breaux, who he then approached for funding to start a project on looking at dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. And then John Breaux used his muscle for a congressional set-aside to NOAA that then turned around and gave us the money to begin the studies. That sort of thing doesn't really work that way anymore. But I've made a difference to take us in a different direction. I'll show you what that was. So I was my only employee, and my office was here, and my microscopes were here, and this is where we had some equipment. My first, 1985, we had Hurricane Juan, which put this much water into the landscape and deposited inches of mud inside the trailer, and they broke a hole at one end, so they just put a fire hose in there and try to get it from one end to the other. So that's how I started my illustrious PhD career. Okay. And then that same year, 1985, we brought the Pelican in from the shipyard, research vessel, that became not my first research vessel. Well, my first summer cruise was on this, and it was the second cruise ever. And at that time, I depended on volunteers, mostly graduate students from LSU, to help me do the work. So when Don got this money, he just had a meeting with two senior scientists from LSU and me, and I didn't know either one of them. One was a physical oceanographer, one was a microbial ecologist, wetland ecology person, and studied nutrients. He said, "Nancy, go forth and study hypoxia, and you better do a good job. And here are two people senior to you that you are going to be in charge of to help you design the study." So that was the beginning of that, and that's gone on 33 years now in these various study areas. But at that point, we were able to start. This is what Lumcon trailers eventually looked like. So it went from trailers in 3 years to this, and I lived through the construction. It has a very nice tower. We have labs, offices, dormitories, apartments. We have research vessels. This is the one that I use the most. It's 57 foot, and the Pelican grew from 95 to 116. But eventually I got into some good lab conditions, and we started studying the low oxygen, and I started studying some of the animals that live in the sediments, not particularly this one, because we did that for some other reason. But my first employee was a master's student from University of New Orleans who knew benthic taxonomy, and we were collecting a lot of samples, and so she was the first hire. And then I got a research project to study larval crabs, and I hired somebody from the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries to help me grow baby stone crabs, and he had a blue thumb and a degree in English. So, but he had a lot of experience in aquatic systems and maintaining aquaria and things like that. So we took off. We started discovering more and more about the low oxygen, and in 1994, my husband and I published a paper that made the front cover of Nature magazine, which is a big deal. And so people started paying attention to the issue more. And then we, of course, started mapping the area. This is just 2 years, one with less water flow and nutrients and one with more nutrients and water flow. And the director of LUMCON moved in 1989 to Maryland, and the new director, well, the first director was the only person at LUMCON who spoke to the press. Nobody else. And after he went north, I started getting calls, and I started realizing that the press can really help bring the science to the public. So I started bringing video photographers and radio show interviews, and if I had the boat time and my time, and we had a cruise planned and the weather was calm, I would take somebody out with me. I've really only come close to killing 2 reporters. One was a reporter. Environmental journalism is also a career possibility. She wanted to swim at the offshore platform. She was out with us. She's from the she was from the Tampa paper. And she wanted to go swimming. I said, okay, I cannot approve you going swimming. But if you accidentally fall in the water, then you will swim around the platform and see the fish, and you'll eventually get back in. I didn't know that she was a very poor swimmer, and the current was, taking her away, so we had to rescue her. The other one was somebody who sailed from Galveston, Texas, to interview me in Cocodrie, Louisiana, and he ran his sailboat into an offshore oil and gas pipeline and the pilings, and sunk his boat, and then had to come picked up by somebody, and while they brought him to LUMCON, we took care of him. And then the way the salvage rights go in Louisiana, his boat was stripped down by the time he got to it because it was open for salvage at that point. Anyway, that's just part of my history. It's not that important. But bringing in the press and telling them the story really elevated the science. So in my crew here, this is Jim Lee. He is a master's student with a physical oceanography degree, and he works for Gene Turner. And he was on the cruise. This is Thomas, a data technician who was on the cruise. This is Laura, who ended up being my primary oxygen meter technician for a long time. She came from Salisbury, Maryland, with a bachelor's degree. This is a friend from Florida, from Mobile. She was working on her master's. This is me. This is my PhD student who went off for a postdoc in Michigan and has come back to Baton Rouge and working for the Water Institute of the Gulf as a coastal ecologist. And this this is David Reeves, who just graduated with a PhD, and he did a lot of work on animals around the offshore platforms. And he's looking for a job. This is like, this person's looking for a job, and he's good. But anyway, here's the crew, and you know, I've had all kinds of weird things, like they want me to stand on the back deck and like this, but it's a lot of fun. So, with all of this press and the increase in the size of the low oxygen in 1994, I put out a press release. It's the first one I ever put out. And this dead smoked crab, a spider crab from the bottom of the Gulf, which I'd taken the picture with other friends before, ended up 2 inches above the fold on the Washington Post on a Sunday morning. And that caught the attention of our Senator, John Breaux, who was the person that gave us the original money. So that was very fortunate. And then there was Senator Olympia Snow, who was a Republican, and she had harmful algal bloom problems in the Gulf of Maine. And you know, they said GOM. I thought, Gulf of Mexico? Well, I never knew there was another GOM until I met Senator Snow and found out about the Gulf of Maine. But the two of them, and this is where I gave my first congressional testimony to the Senate Commerce Subcommittee for Transportation and something else. But they fund the Coast Guard, but then they also have other money. And what came out of this was the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Act of 1994, or more commonly the Snowglobe bill. And it was bipartisan, and it had a lot of support. And it began studies within NOAA of competitive research, so groups could go after money to study it. And so that's how we got it started. And so we're still in this era here of finding out what's going on and developing management plans and reassessing. So that's going along swimmingly well. And then there was an action plan. And then there was another action plan that seemed to stagnate a little bit. This is somebody from the Times-Picayune. Oh, and then I've maintained good press relations over the years too. So Mark Schlefstein from the Times-Picayune is a Pulitzer Prize winner, environmental journalist. And I have one from Tampa. And then the Jody Warwick from the the Baltimore Sun. They're all Pulitzer Prize winners. And then when I got into the oil spill era, I was like on a speed dial with the LA Times and New York Times and the Washington Post. And they would call me every day, "What's new, Nancy? What's new, Nancy?" And if it wasn't a disaster, they would hang up and, call somebody else. So, and then this got me involved in some National Academies reports that made recommendations for dealing with the nutrients and the hypoxia. And again, more action plans. And this one put off the time goal by 20 more years. And then, so we continue on. So these are the type of funding I've had. I have managed to keep going. I have trained a lot of people who end up leaving me when I don't want them to leave. I lost a 13-year data manager. So I have data managers working for me. I have phytoplankton taxonomists working for me, benthic ecologists working for me, GIS specialists to plot out a lot of our oil spill data onto the landscape because we've got so many different working parts. So those are some of the jobs that have gone around me that my students, or I've hired people to do that. But that's just a very small example of the types of jobs that an environmental science training can get you. there's always, my nose is giving me trouble here. Well, we'll just do this. So there are things that you never think of. I have a student right now who's a very good artist, and we teach a science and art camp at LumCon every summer for high school students. And I bet you she's going to end up going in to graphic artist work, but related to natural resources. I just know she's not going to go the academic route. She may work for a state agency. I have two graphic artist people that I've known through LumCon. One was an employee of mine, and one was the wife of a graduate student working with somebody else. They're both fabulous graphic artists. They're both in Seattle right now, and they work with museums, nonprofit agencies, to generate graphics for their outreach programs. And then they also make money just doing artwork. Trying to think, one of my number one technician who did the instrumentation for the platform got it all ready and brought it back and downloaded the data. She's now working for a consulting company on the Atlantic coast, and she dives for them, and she's their lead diver. And some of the work she does is swimming transects across offshore waters of Puerto Rico looking for old torpedoes or mines. Yeah, sounds like fun, doesn't it? I'm not suggesting that. Graphic arts is a lot safer. State agencies, county agencies, federal agencies, conservation services, USGS, there's all kinds of positions out there. The very hardest one to get is that first one. And very often they're looking for a master's degree, at least, or some experience. Like my English major came in with experience growing crustaceans. So that was I just did that. And it worked out wonderfully, and then he became that 13-year data manager that left me in the lurch. So, so that's sort of jobs that circulate around me and that I interact with over the years in my career. And I'm looking forward to being a little old lady on the back end of a houseboat somewhere down in the bayou, writing manuscripts in maybe 5 years from now. So I won't have any employees, but anyway, open for questions. I don't know if you want to moderate or...
I can, but I think we can open up first and see if anybody has any questions or thoughts.
All right, so how many of you working on your master's degree? A lot of you. Okay, PhD degrees. Non-earth science degrees. Okay. What's yours?
MBA.
Okay.
But I already have a
Okay.
master's degree
Okay.
in sociology and sustainable agriculture.
Okay. So I wanted my daughter to be an environmental lawyer, but that's after she said no way to being a biologist. But she is very good at graphic arts and photography, and she's a museum educator right now. So those sorts of jobs exist. There's education programs associated with many agencies, EPA, the Nature Conservancy. Along the coast, there are national estuary programs. There are Sea Grant programs around the Great Lakes that all have environmental education positions to work at. So does anybody know exactly what their first job is going to be? I didn't either. I was a ranger rick for one summer, and then I stumbled into being a benthic taxonomist, and that got me into all these other things that I got interested in. Anybody know exactly what they want to be their first job? Nobody wants to be my crab grower. Yeah. So any experience you can get working with a research project or something like that on your way through is definitely going to give you some experience if you don't have the degrees to go with it. So that experience is very important, and you should take advantages of summer internships. They don't usually pay much, but they give you an opportunity to learn something. I know my daughter did many unpaid internships through her college career, and it did not get her a job, but she eventually surfaced with being an educator at the Seattle Museum of History and Industry. So, yeah.
How valuable is a PhD compared to just like a master's degree in the field?
It depends on the field. There are many PhD researchers turned academicians in public schools nowadays. I know a chemist who just got his PhD, and he's going to go teach in a high school. And when I was coming up in high school, there were some PhDs in high school. So the best schools are looking for a PhD. It's very important if you're going to go into a career like mine, which was straight academia. It's not so important if you're going to work, but you know, like the U.S. Geological Survey, there are entry-level positions that do not require a PhD. And sometimes you can get that along the way and further your career in that direction. Masters nowadays is almost always looked for when you're hiring people to work for you on a research project, but there's not always those kind of people around. So, yeah, take your chances with some. I have, wiping your eye, you had a question, and there's a question over here. Go ahead.
I was wondering, or I wanted, okay, sorry. How do you maintain a good, like, relationship with the press and the public and, like, all three? Have you, like, ran into any ducks working?
Oh, yeah. Other than two I almost killed. I have slammed the phone down on one reporter. Only did it once. You have to be patient because they have a story that's due at 5 o'clock and they call you at 1 o'clock and they don't know a thing about hypoxia. And you do your best to work with them. Or they can be very pushy and try to lead you to an answer that they want to hear, and you have to know to avoid that. Just like a politician. Start talking about something else. So I guess I could be a politician as well. So I deal with the press a lot. I was fortunate enough to be named to a group called the Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellows Program in 1999. And I was already doing work with the press. And I'd already given congressional testimony and done things on the Hill. But they had beginning PhDs and more established PhDs who did this kind of work. And it was to train people to do the three-second elevator talk, maybe 1 minute at the most. We were all videotaped, and everybody in the group critiqued your videotape. We had to write op-eds. We just had to do all kinds of things. And then we had a week in Washington where we actually went into some chambers and put on a mock congressional testimony with some of the more senior people playing the senators and representatives on the back, and some of us younger, the other people were giving the testimony. And that was a real learning experience. Some very prominent ecologists would sit around the back and talk about football, and there was Jane Lubchenco, the head of NOAA, during Obama's administration. She would be the perky little staff member that would walk around and talk to all the congressional people in the back, you know, take their attention away. They weren't paying any attention to the people that were testifying. I had already given testimony, so I got interviewed by Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb guy, as I walked out of testimony. And, you know, he stuck a mic in my face, and I had to come through. Stuart Pym, who is a very well-known ornithologist, we were testifying about biodiversity and the need to maintain biodiversity. And he is Mr. Biodiversity with birds and conservation. And he got up and he was like the opposing people. And he testified along the lines of, I don't really know why you need so many kinds of birds. There are always birds around. You don't need to conserve birds. There's always going to be a bird. And I don't know what the problem is with the ecologists that don't, you know, worry about how many and too many kinds of birds. We don't need those birds. You know, it just went on and on. So it was very interesting. And so that's how you learn. I have given talks at the Society for Environmental Journalism over the years on hypoxia. I take their invitations and go. I have a PowerPoint that is, it's like a stack of books, and the one on the top is Scientists Are from Venus, Journalists Are from Mars. And then I have another book called He Said, She Said. And then I have these divisions of ideas about what a scientist is expecting. They're expecting a lot of face time. What the journalist is expecting, and answer right away. So there's training, there's a lot of training on that sort of stuff now at professional society meetings. Didn't used to be very common, but it's common now. And always try to answer them. Always get back with them, because if you don't, like I didn't with a reporter this morning, because I just didn't have time. There's a new article coming out in Science. She wanted my opinion on it. I just couldn't get to it because I'm traveling. But she knew to call me because I've answered her calls many other times. So responding to the press, unless you don't want to talk to that particular person. And then I recommend my husband. Yes.
You seem to be still really involved in field work.
Yes.
I feel like it's, you continue in academia, you can really lose touch in that. How did you maintain, did you just set time that I'm going to go out on the ship every so many days?
Yeah, well, we had a sampling regime. We had a sample schedule, and we stuck to it as best as we could. We knew every other month we were going to go to the 2 transects, and we would set the schedule with we were dependent on a ship, people, and weather to get the work done. And it didn't always work out. And our diving trips to change out instruments depended even more on the weather. So all of that work came fairly frequently. Now I'm just going out once a year on the shelf-wide cruise, and that's not enough for me. Last year we were still diving. I might not dive this year because I had an arm injury and I'm just old. So professors at LSU, because I was my own boss for a long, long time, but there's teaching commitments, and you try to plan around them. 2 of my graduate students in my writing course might have been gone on Monday, but the weather didn't look good, so they put it off later to the week so they could be in class. And I told them, I said, I understand. If you only get a clear day of weather, you've got to go do it. So some people understand and some people don't. And even when I was director, I was in the field a lot. Otherwise, I would go crazy. Because we do these high school shadowing things at the lab. And so they'll come in, I'll meet them, and I said, this is what I do all day, and I'll type on my computer and answer my email and, you know, do some data analysis. I said, now you're going to go see the people who really do something every day, and then my technicians and stuff would spend some time with them. Because, yeah, it's good to be in the field. It's good to be outside. It's healthy. Yes.
So you've had a lot of emphasis on internships and real world experiences and getting that, just going out there and getting some of that. But, so part of my problem is I am a research assistant, and so I'm going to be required to be at the university doing research for a professor the entire year. So I'm afraid that when I graduate, I will
Oh, get your degree and do a good job of it. That's the priority. To me, that's the priority. And I was 3 years out of my master's before I went back to work on my PhD. And it was a hard decision because I was making good money doing what I was doing. And I didn't know what was at the end of that PhD. I only had two options. One was to go to LumCon, and the other one was to do a postdoc in Fort Pierce, Florida. And I knew the postdoc before me in that position, he was driving a UPS vehicle. So you never know what's going to be out there. But when you've got a chance to do something good, you do it good. It's like if you're in a bad relationship. You know, let it go. You might not know what's on the other side, but you know. Something else will always pop up. Yes.
As you transitioned from sort of entry level or field work in the beginning towards more leadership roles, did that seem to happen organically, or did you kind of make a concerted effort to develop management or leadership skills?
My efforts began along those lines by going to regional science meetings. There's a Gulf Estuarine Research Society that's part of the larger Estuarine Research Federation, and all the regions have local meetings, and I would start going to those because that was a very good way for a student to give a talk in a non-threatening environment. And then I went to so many of them that I finally became an officer, and I was the secretary-treasurer for too long. And I never volunteered to be the president because it's the same thing. You never know. You never know if you're going to find another president to take over, and you don't want to be it forever. So, and then it got me into the national level organization as well. And I let myself be nominated. I did volunteer work at meetings, and you just start to meet people. And I've been on the National Sea Grant Advisory Board. I've been on the Ocean Studies Board. They just, as your work, if it's good, gains prominence, and you are professional and you do a good job at your research, you start getting these invitations to serve. And that's how you get to build up that portfolio. My daughter used to go with me to all the GERS meetings from when she was about 4 years old to maybe 8. She would sit at the registration table with me and help me take money and give out name tags. She was a good girl.
So she got the experience too.
She did, yeah. So, when I'm going to these other meetings, the more national level meetings, we did one in Florida, and she was out at the pool with a babysitter. And the babysitter told me, said, everybody knows her. They're always walking by and saying hi. It's because she goes all to those meetings with and sits at the registration table. Pretty funny. Yes, sir.
What sort of opportunities do you see for environmental scientists in the private sector? How do you think their requirements for people there?
I see many people take jobs at DEQs or DNRs, and then DEQ or DNR loses them because they go to a consulting company, because they now have some experience in the regulatory framework. But I also have a student TA right now who's working for an environmental consulting company while she's finishing her master's degree. So that can happen before, during, or after, I think. But the state DEQs and DNRs just hate training and losing people, but they don't pay as much money. Well, I trained a minority educator who was with me for a year and then went off to DEQ, and now he's working for a consulting company. People move on. They don't promise to work for you forever. Yes, anybody?
We're about near the end of our time.
Okay,
So
all right.
that's perfect. So let's just give another round of thanks.
So I'm Bill Simpkins. I was part of the committee that brought Nancy here. I introduced her last night, and we have the Ronald Lecture every year. Last year we had an environmental lawyer that did water policy, And we hope to have this continuing year after year, so look for the Ronald Lecture when it comes up next year. We usually have it in April. We try to do it during Earth Day, but we had some conflicts around Earth Day, so we moved it up, and we were happy to partner with the Water Conference to kind of make this happen. So hopefully a lot of you got to see her.
Last night, that was fun.
Yeah, yeah, and the food was good too, but. I would want to, just real quick, second what she said about the fact that getting involved in professional organizations is really a good thing. I differ with a lot of my colleagues, and I'm a professor in the geology department, and I differ with colleagues that say that you should do as little service as possible because you should emphasize your research, and that's your big thing. Unfortunately, if everybody did that, there would be no societies working, there'd be no meetings, there'd be no awards, there'd be nothing. So somebody has to do this, and I think your colleagues, when you get involved in it, very much appreciate the fact that you get involved in it. And I was elected to the 12-member board of the entire Geological Society of America. I served for 3 years. The reason that got me that position was because I had been a head of a division, I'd been a technical program chair for the national meeting, I'd done all these things that led up to that, and you know, it just kind of snowballs. And once they find out that you can do this stuff, it's great.
And it broadens your contact.
It does. And also, interestingly enough, when I got a Distinguished Service Award from my division in the Geological Society of America, and one part of the speech that I mentioned was that it was those things that I learned in the society that then helped me be a department chair for 3 years. So leadership, you know, you can go to leadership training all you want. A lot of it's on the ground learning. So if you start with small committees and you learn how to run meetings, you learn how not to run meetings, okay, which I've seen a lot of people do poorly at. You can learn a lot, and so what you want as a professional is you want to be known, you want to have a great research record, and you also like to be part of a greater group of a community that feels like you're doing a good job and be accepted by it. So there's a lot of things to this equation, and you know, I was told not to take the GSA council job and not be on the board, and I said, nuts. I just said, I'm going to do it. So sometimes you have to make those decisions.
I had worked on some oil and gas pollutants that were dumped into the canals in Louisiana. And that also eventually led to a change in EPA regulations, so you couldn't do it anymore. You had to re-inject or take it somewhere else. But my director at the time, I was being asked to be an expert witness for Louisiana DEQ, and I had to ask him if I could take the time to go do it. And he said, you might as well, your research isn't worth anything anyway. Yeah.
She has 125 peer-reviewed publications out there. Yeah.
And the other thing is that this Aldo Leopold leadership thing that I did, they only took tenured faculty, so you had to be an associate, because so many universities do not think you should spend the time being involved with policy issues. And it doesn't count like a paper or teaching a course. So they took only those that were tenured at the time to train them up, and they've become an incredible group of people that work together on all kinds of issues.
And how can you be involved in hypoxia and not be involved in policy? That's what I don't understand. They are just right there. So anyway, well, we got to quit because we're going to go hear Kathy Kling's talk.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, and
Thank
give
you.
Nancy another round of applause here.